We have a 2013 Mercedes Sprinter. The problem with this Sprinter is the check engine light remains on the dash when the engine is running. So I'm going to get the scan tool connected so we can see what kind of trouble codes we have in the engine computer. Okay, so our scan tool is connected to the vehicle, but before we scan this, I am going to confirm the customer's complaint first. Let's start the engine and see if the check engine light is going to remain on while the engine is running. Right there, as you can hear, the engine is running and the check engine light remained on the dash. So customer's complaint confirmed. So we have confirmed the customer's complaint. I'm going to turn off the engine. I'm going to turn the key on. Let's bring up our scan tool and see what kind of trouble codes we have in the engine computer. Hold on. If you're not a subscriber to this channel, I have a favor to ask you. I want you to subscribe to the channel, ring the bell so you can get notified every time I upload a new video. Leave me a comment if you can. Smash the like button. I would really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Now let's continue with our video. All right, I'm gonna bring up our scan tool over here. Let's see what we got. So this is a Mercedes. Let's do a fault scan. This is going to scan all the control units on the vehicle. The scan tool is done scanning all the control units on the vehicle. And here are the trouble codes that we have in the engine computer. And these two trouble codes are causing the check engine light to remain on the dash while the engine is running. The first trouble code is P154900, and it says component Y27/13 exhaust gas recirculation cooling solenoid valve has open circuit. And then the second one is P154900, and it says component Y27/13 exhaust gas recirculation cooling solenoid valve is faulty. So basically this code, this one is saying something about the circuit, and this is actually telling us about the state of the valve. So the valve is faulty. Now, I'm very familiar with this code. This code usually is set when there is a problem in the solenoid wiring or when the solenoid is open. This is a 2-wire solenoid, very basic and very simple. So we're gonna go under the hood and test the wiring of the solenoid. If the wiring is good, the problem is gonna be the solenoid, okay? So these other trouble codes over here will not cause the check engine light to remain on while the engine is running. Only these two trouble codes are causing the check engine light to remain on while the engine is running. So let's scroll down and see what else we have. Okay, so since we're here to fix what's causing the check engine light to remain on the dash, we're gonna go into the engine computer. We're gonna click on this arrow over here. Let's look at the codes once again. As you can see, we have our same trouble codes over here. Okay, so this component Y27/13 is the switchover valve that sends a vacuum to the vacuum actuator that's on the back of the EGR cooler. Okay, we're gonna go straight under the hood to the valve and do some tests at the valve. I don't have to look at the wiring diagram or how this valve works because I know how it works. I've done this several times, okay? It's very simple. It's a 2-wire solenoid, there is vacuum that goes to this solenoid. It's a normally closed solenoid. When the engine computer opens it, it allows vacuum to go from one side of the valve to the other side of the valve to actuate a vacuum actuator on the back of the EGR cooler. Okay, so this valve over here kind of works like a vent solenoid or a purge solenoid. Okay, just like any regular two-wire solenoid works. So it works the same way. It's an on and off solenoid. It's a solenoid that's open and closes when the computer energizes it. And the wires at this solenoid come from the computer. So the computer supplies power and ground to this solenoid. Okay, so what we're gonna do now that we know our trouble codes, we're gonna go under the hood and do some tests at the solenoid. So now let's go under the hood and do that. Because what usually causes this trouble code to be set is either a defective solenoid or a problem in the wiring between the solenoid and the engine computer. So the solenoid is right over here. Okay, so our switchover valve is this guy over here. So it's right below the cabin air filter housing. So there are two wires down here at the electrical connector of the solenoid. So there is vacuum on this line. So vacuum is supplied to the solenoid with the engine running, and when the solenoid is energized, vacuum flows from this line through the solenoid and it comes down this line. And as vacuum travels down this line, it comes down over here. Okay, so this line over here goes to this actuator. Okay, and it actuates this actuator over here. Okay, so since we have a circuit code on the scan tool, okay, the first code says the solenoid has an open circuit, and then the other one says the valve is faulty. So I believe we have vacuum at the valve, because the way you go about this is you check for a presence of vacuum first. You make sure there's a vacuum here, and then you check your wiring. So now what I'm gonna do is we're gonna check the wiring of this valve. We're gonna do that by using a test light. I am going to connect a test light to the wires of this solenoid. So I'm going to disconnect the solenoid first. There's a little dust cap that goes over here, right there. It fell down. I'm gonna have to get it. I'm going to use a test light and back probe these two wires. We're gonna bypass this solenoid with a test light, and then we're gonna use our bidirectional controls on the scan tool to turn on this solenoid. When we turn on the solenoid, the test light should light, okay? Since we're gonna be bypassing the solenoid with the test light. If the test light lights, that will tell me that the wiring is good, and at that point, the problem is gonna be a defective solenoid, okay? I'm going to back probe these wires off camera, and then I'll bring you guys back. Now I'm using this big test light to bypass our switchover valve. As you can see, I have these jumper wires connected to the electrical connector of this switchover valve, and this red jumper wire is going to this side of the test light, and then this white jumper wire goes to this side of the test light. So the test light is connected in series of these two wires, okay? So now let's look at our scan tool. I am going to erase the code now. Let's see if this code is gonna go away after we erase it. For some reason that code keeps coming back. Let me go in the vehicle and start the engine. Let's try to turn on this solenoid. When I turn on that solenoid, if the wiring between the solenoid and the computer is good, the test light is gonna light. So watch this. I'm gonna press this button over here. So watch the light, watch the test light as I'm pressing this button on the scan tool. Right there, as you can see, the test light comes on. If I press this F3 button over here on the scan tool, the test light is gonna go off. Watch. Test light goes off. I press the F2. I press the F4 button. Test light comes on. F3, test light goes out. F4, test light comes on. Okay, so this over here tells us that this wiring, okay, this switchover valve wiring is good because the test light comes on. So we're gonna turn it off again with the scan tool. I'm gonna press F3. We're good to go. The wiring of that switchover valve is good. Okay, so I'm gonna go in the vehicle and turn off the engine. So we're good to go. At this point, we can go ahead and replace this switchover valve. Okay, the switchover valve is defective. The wiring is good. Okay, we were able to turn on the test light with the scan tool. So this tells us that the wiring is good. Now, before we replace this valve, I want to make sure that we are receiving vacuum at this tube over here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this tube and make sure that there is vacuum there. So we know that our wiring is good. Okay, so we can remove our test light. We can get rid of the test light. We're done with the test light. Okay, so we don't have a wiring problem. Now I'm going to disconnect this vacuum tube over here. So this switchover valve is just a regular 2-wire solenoid. Okay, so I'm gonna disconnect this tube off camera, and then I'll bring you guys back up. I'm gonna connect a vacuum gauge to it. I'm gonna start the engine. With the engine running, we should have vacuum at this tube. I'm gonna get this disconnected and then I'll bring you guys back up. I got a vacuum gauge connected to this line that goes to this small port of the switchover valve. As you can see, we have 0 vacuum right now. Okay, so I'm gonna leave it over here. Let's go in the vehicle and start the engine. With the engine running, we should have vacuum at this line. So we checked the electrical side of the solenoid, that's good. So now we're gonna check the mechanical side, the vacuum side of the solenoid. If that's good, we're gonna go ahead and replace this. So check this out, let's see what we got. As you can see, we now have vacuum. Okay, we have 13 inches of vacuum. Okay, remember, this gauge was at 0. Now it's showing 13 inches of vacuum. So that's good, okay? We have vacuum at this solenoid. So now I'm gonna go back in the van and turn off the engine. So at this point, we can go ahead and replace this solenoid. But before we do that, so look at our gauge. Our gauge is going back slowly. Okay, we are losing vacuum slowly. I mean, the gauge is still connected. You see the gauge going back slowly. It's going back to 0. Okay, so that's good. Now I'm gonna disconnect this gauge. Okay. I'm going to reconnect the electrical connector of the switchover valve. Let's do one last quick test. So the electrical connector is reconnected down here, so we're good. I'm going to reconnect the vacuum supply tube. I have my vacuum gauge connected to this tube over here. So now I'm going to go in the vehicle and start the engine, and then we're going to turn on the valve with our scan tool. So the engine is running, as you can hear. So right now our gauge should be showing 0. Okay, the gauge is at 0, so that's good. So we're going to turn on our solenoid. So the solenoid is on. We know the wiring of the solenoid works. Let's look at the gauge. Okay, we're still stuck at 0. Okay, so there's no vacuum coming down this line. Okay, so as you can see over here on the scan tool, our test says active. So the test is active right now. So we should have vacuum flowing from this side of the valve to this tube over here. Okay, and that should send vacuum to this gauge. As you can see, the gauge is stuck at 0. So this valve over here is bad. We're gonna have to replace this switchover valve. And once we replace that switchover valve, this is gonna be fixed. So I'm gonna go in the vehicle and turn off the engine. So we did some tests. We have determined that the switchover valve is defective. I'm gonna call the Mercedes dealership and get a new switchover valve. After I get the valve, I will bring you guys back up so we can install it. I have received a new switchover valve from the dealer. Here it is. Okay, so here is our brand new switchover valve, and there is the old one. So now I'm going to remove the old one and install the new one. After I get this new one installed, we're going to do our last test before we wrap up this video. I still have my gauge connected to the line that goes to the actuator on the back of the EGR cooler. So now let's get this switchover valve installed. All right, I'm gonna disconnect these tubes over here first. I'm removing this old switchover valve. So here it is. Here is our old switchover valve. So you basically just disconnect these two tubes that go up here. The small one is the vacuum supply, and then the big tube is the tube that goes to the actuator. And then you disconnect the electrical connector, and after that you're good. So this is the old one, and this over here is the new one. As you can see, this one is dirty and this one over here is clean. So I'm gonna get the old one out of the way. There's a little plastic cap that goes over here. I'm gonna find it. So this cap is gonna go over here. Okay, and then I'm gonna connect my vacuum lines. This one is gonna go over here, and then this one is gonna go over here. So I got my new switchover valve installed. So now let's start the engine and verify our repair. The electrical connector is connected, so we're good to go. I still have my vacuum gauge connected to this tube over here. Okay, so now let's go in the vehicle and start the engine. So as you can hear, the engine is running. We're gonna look at the gauge. Right now the gauge is showing 0, okay? Remember before, when we turned on the switchover valve, the gauge was still showing 0, okay? Because this old switchover valve over here is open. Okay, so we got 0 on the gauge. So now I am going to turn on the valve. When we turn on the valve, our gauge should now be reading vacuum. We should have a vacuum reading on the gauge right now. So I'm going to click on F4. It says active. Now let's look at the gauge. You see that? So we now have vacuum on the gauge. Okay. So I'm going to turn this off. As I turn this off, the gauge goes down. Hold on, I'm going to try to get the gauge and the scan tool on one shot. Okay. So watch the gauge as I press on F4 on the scan tool. So watch that. I press on F4, the gauge goes up to 30 inches of vacuum. So now I'm going to press F3, see what happens. Watch that. Okay, it goes down to 0. I press F4. So let's redo that one more time. Okay, our gauge went up to 30 inches of vacuum. I'm going to press F3. As you can see, our gauge came back to 0. So this is good, guys. This is fixed. Okay. So now I just have to disconnect this gauge to this line and then reconnect this line to this one, and then we should be good to go. Now I'm going to go in the vehicle and turn off the engine. So this was a quick and easy one. So I'm going to disconnect the gauge, so we are done with our testing. I'm going to reconnect this vacuum hose to this plastic tube over here. Okay, so just like that, our switchover valve is new. Right there, brand new switchover valve. Okay, so that's good. So now let's look at the scan tool for one last time. Let's back out. Let's make sure that our trouble code, our circuit open trouble code, doesn't come back. Let me make sure the key is on. I'm sorry if I'm going back and forth with this. This is pretty easy to do, but I just want to make sure that we cover all our bases before we give this vehicle back to the customer. So we have our circuit open trouble code. Let's clear it. And this code is a hard code. So if the problem is still there, the code will be back. So we're gonna clear it. Let's see if it's gonna go away. It should go away because we installed a new switchover valve. Okay, so our code is gone. So we're good to go. Let's try to read the code again. Right there. No trouble codes are detected. So we're good. So now let's go in the vehicle and start the engine. The check engine light should be off. While the engine is running. Okay, so right there, check engine light is off. So this is fixed, guys. This was a quick and easy one. So I'm gonna leave this right over here. This van is fixed. What was causing the check engine light to remain on the dash while the engine was running was a defective switchover valve for the EGR system. We did some tests. We determined that the switchover valve was defective. It was open. We checked the wiring. We checked for our vacuum supply. We did have power and ground at the switchover valve. We had vacuum there. So that confirmed to us that the switchover valve was defective. We replaced the switchover valve and now all is well. So I hope you liked the video. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you don't like the video, give it a thumb down. But if you do, you gotta tell me why so we can make better videos in the future. If this is your first time here, subscribe to the channel. Ring the bell so you can get notified every time I upload a new video. If you have any comments, questions, criticism, leave them in the comment box. Thanks for watching. See you next time.